systems and figuring out about Six Sigma metrics. And when she applied that, she realized that their basic QC procedures in Theranos violated the Westgard rules and were very, very far away from Six Sigma quality. And because she recognized that and knew her professional responsibility, she knew she should blow the whistle. So knowing Six Sigma can help you do big things. And if you're not doing Six Sigma, or if you're not providing Six Sigma, it may be fatal to your company. So here are the 7 things we want to learn today. One of them is going to be a bit of history and theory, where this whole concept came from and whether or why it is still worth knowing. The second thing, we're going to briefly talk about the colorful terminology associated with Six Sigma, the black belts and so forth, and how important those are. Next, we'll tackle the real meaning of the 6 in Six Sigma. And then we will talk about transforming tolerance limits, which are the concept that comes from industry and manufacturing and Six Sigma theory, into total allowable errors, which is something we're much more familiar with in the laboratory. We will learn 2 ways to determine the sigma metric. That is, one by just counting defects and the other by calculating the variation. We will also look at common benchmarks on the sigma scale. That is, we'll look at how things measure up when we use the sigma scale and how that might motivate us to target what needs to be fixed faster than other things. And then finally, I'll review some of the sigmametric tools that we make available that are available to you in your lab. So let's start with Six Sigma history. And it's probably useful to think of Six Sigma not as some movement that was entirely unrelated to everything else in the quality movement. It's really, it's part of the evolving quality management, and it's another phase of development of the quality approach. So we can go all the way back to a century ago when we have the first automated production line created. And then 1924, the infamous Walter Schuhart brings statistical quality control. That is, if you can imagine, we've had less than 100 years of statistical quality control. There may be some of you wishing you could go back 100 years and not have to look at QC charts. So when you curse QC charts, don't curse Westgard, curse Schuhart, because it's really his fault. Then in the 1980s, Motorola, William Smith, he creates the term Six Sigma. 1987, not unrelated, we have the first global quality standards beginning to develop through the ISO organization. Motorola, coming in the 90s, they come up with the DMAIC, Define, Measure, Analyze, Improve, Control approach, and this black belt system. In 1995, GE introduces Six Sigma within their own operations, and that makes it very famous. So the 90s and the early 2000s was when Six Sigma was really hot, really exciting. And then for the laboratory medicine, April Fool's Day of the year 2000 was really the single paper that brought, or I should say the first paper that brought Six Sigma and the Six Sigma scale into the laboratory. Was the work of David Nevalainen and Lucia Berti and their collaborators. And they took College of American Pathologists, CAP, Q probes, and then put that data on the Sigma scale. And that was our first taste of Six Sigma with some pre-analytical and post-analytical processes. Let's move on to our second topic, which is black belts. And let me first say, no disrespect to those who have gone through the rigorous training to become a belt of Six Sigma, but peak Six Sigma is past us. We're now, if Six Sigma was really hot in the year 2000, well, it's 20 years later, and now the cult aspect, the fad period of Six Sigma is gone. Now it's more of a tool. And you may not need all of the different colorful titles. So there's a green belt. That is meant to say you have a job, but you also do some of the Six Sigma stuff as well. A black belt is really meant to indicate you're professional, your whole career is doing Six Sigma, and you go around to different parts of your organization or your company applying Six Sigma. Master black belt is meant to be you're the person who oversees all the other black belts. So you're like their overlord. And then champion was meant to be someone in the C-suite, one of the executive leaders who promotes, supports, champions, defends Six Sigma as it's being rolled out across the organization. I think that was mainly a way to get more C-suite buy-in into this. But truth be told, the color of your belt does not matter. Just use the Sigma tools. You'll be able to use Six Sigma whether or not you have these particular sets of training or these titles. Now, certainly, again, I don't want to diminish those who are black belts, who have gone through a lot more training than what we will be able to touch on in this hour. But you don't need that specialized training to apply an equation or count the number of defects. Now let's go into the 6 in Six Sigma. So why is it called Six Sigma? Why isn't it called 7 Sigma or 2 Sigma or 3.14 Pi Sigma? There is a reason. There's a concept, and the simplest concept is we want 6 standard deviations to fit between the value we're supposed to get and the tolerance specification. So there is a value we want. There is, let's call it a perfect score. That's what we should have. If you think about it as a patient, there is a true health status of the patient, and we would like to measure that. But if we make a million measurements of that patient, we will not get the exact same answer every time. We'll get a normalized distribution, right? A bell curve. And it's okay if we don't get the exact same answer, right? We can get something close to it, and the clinician will still understand what's going on with the patient, and they won't get a different diagnosis. But if here is the patient's true status and we get too far away from that, at a certain point, a sick person starts to look healthy by that test result, or vice versa. A normal person starts to look sick because their result is so far away from where they really are. So those tolerance specifications are essentially telling us you have to stay within this zone in order to have a useful result. If we want to get the right diagnosis for a patient, we have to stay within these tolerance specifications. And what Six Sigma chose is between that tolerance specification and the target. That's where the 6 comes from. Now, there's a little bit more math behind that. So they're looking at, this is the classic idea of Six Sigma, where they're actually building in what they call a 1.5S shift or drift, that they say, look, in a normal process, things might change, over time, things might drift actually as much as 1.5 SD. But we want to make sure even if that happens, then there'll still only be 3.4 errors per million outputs of that process. So that's where the that's how much of the tail is beyond that tolerance limit or quality goal, even if we have a 1.5 SD shift. And that 1.5 SD shift is a matter of some debate. That goes into deep Six Sigma theory. I will tackle it one more time as we go through this introduction. One of the ways that we address it is we calculate on a different scale where we don't have to make this assumption about a long-term drift in the process. There is an even more technical derivation of Six Sigma that connects up to the early Westgard work on quality. So there is the critical systematic error, and that concept was developed by the Westgard in the 80s and 90s. And then it was related through the following equations to the sigma metric that Motorola and GE had developed. So we have an actual mathematical derivation of how the concepts that were already present prior to Six Sigma in laboratory medicine actually connect up and equate with the sigma metric that is coming from manufacturing and industry. So I'm going to walk through the different sigmas. So Six Sigma itself, that's the goal. And at Six Sigma, only 3.4 defects out of 1 million outcomes. And essentially, this is defect-free, almost, nearly. This is where you're going to achieve your highest efficiency, highest reliability. Your customer is going to be their most happy because this process is almost never giving them the wrong output. And when you have all of that, you get your maximum profitability. You don't have to spend money to do something over. Your customer isn't going to return something or complain to you. They're happy, they use you again. It's good for your business. Common benchmarks that achieve Six Sigma. Well, airline safety, not exactly the best example to use because airline safety is very safe right now because almost nobody's flying. But back, a year ago, there were still only 2.9 crashes per million departures in the US, which is less than the 3.4. So that is actually a little bit better than Six Sigma. Within the laboratory, in a recent accounting of pre-analytical errors, the number of samples damaged in transport, number of samples not stored properly before analysis, the median achievement is Six Sigma. So at the pre-analytical phase, there are laboratory processes that are at Six Sigma. I'm giving you a hint about what you do for QC depending on your Sigma status. And at Six Sigma, you do as little as possible. You probably need to run 2 controls, although mathematically you could get by with 1 control, but there's no regulator around the world that would allow that. And you don't need the Westgard rules at Six Sigma. You can just go with wide limits like 3SD. 5 Sigma is considered excellent performance. It's about 233 defects per million. In the laboratory, the number of misidentified requests, number of misidentified samples, that is a 5 Sigma process. QC advice, you're still doing very well. You don't need all the Westgard rules. You can go to 3, the first 3 Westgard rules, and stick with 2 controls per run. At 4 Sigma, that's still good, but now the numbers are going up. We got more than 6,200 defects per million. This is, to match this up, this is about the rate of misplaced checked luggage by US airlines. 1 out of 300 pieces of your luggage gets a different vacation than you do. Also matching up with how often do we see that the sample coming to the lab, there's an insufficient volume. How often do we see a hemolyzed sample? It's about a 4 Sigma process. And as you can probably guess, we need to do a little bit more. We're not using all the Westgard rules, but now we're doing 4 Westgard rules. And we either have to do 4 controls per run, or we're going to do 2 controls on this run, and we're going to use the 2 measurements we made in the last run. 3 sigma. Now 3 sigma is considered the minimum acceptable performance. And below that, it is considered too unstable. 3 sigma is about 67,000 defects per million. And this is where you start generating a lot of extra workarounds, fixing the broken process. 3 sigma, the frequency that your microbiology samples get contaminated, that's close to 3 sigma. And at 3 sigma, you need all the Westgard rules. 3 sigma, all the Westgard rules. And again, you either do 4 controls per run, or you're doing 2 controls per run, and you're going to do it over at least 2 runs. If you want the 10x rule, it's really over 5 runs for that rule. Below 3 sigma, again, considered unacceptable. We might have 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 defects per million. Similar to how often you don't leave on time for your plane. That level of frustration you have with airlines, that's what 3 sigma is, below 3 sigma. And that's where we're doing the maximum number of Westgard rules. We're doing all of them, but even that isn't enough. Essentially, the Westgards, we've run out of rules to help you. Do all the Westgard rules, do something more. Can you go to 8 controls per run? No? Well, then 2 controls and then 4, 5 runs over which you're going to look at things. You can see how the worse you get, the more effort you have to try and put on the back end to monitor and QC this process. There are 2 ways that we can work on the sigma scale. The first one, this is what Motorola GE did. You're measuring the outcome. And this is how most processes in business, manufacturing, healthcare, laboratory, that's how most of them are doing their sigma-metric calculations. They're just looking at the process, looking at the outcomes of that process and saying, how many defects occurred? Turnaround time. What's my turnaround time? Is my tolerance limit an hour, 60 minutes, 65, 75? Well, now I'm going to count how many of these reports, how many did I actually make within that time? How many defects actually occurred? And then from that, you then calculate the defects per million rate. You went through 1,000 and you got a certain number of, you got 10 divided by 1,000, now put it on the scale of 1,000,000. And then from that, you look up in a table. It will tell you this is your defects per million, then this is your sigma metric. And you're going to look at this short-term sigma metric, which includes that 1.5 SD shift. Now, that might work for a lot of processes, but for analytical quality, it doesn't really work. Because if I get a result back on my cholesterol, on my glucose, and the number is 5, is that a defect? Is that not a defect? How do I know? The only way to know would be, well, I'm going to make measurements against a reference method, or I'm going to measure you or me. I'm going to measure you 5 times and see if I get the same result. That's not how we normally handle these things. We don't test multiple times a single patient sample. So instead, what we can do is measure the variation of the process. And that means figuring out the standard deviation and figuring out the trueness or bias. Good news about that, of course, you already do this. So Six Sigma is going to tap into the data and performance that you already have, that you have been measuring since you walked into the laboratory, since the laboratory opened its doors. And from that data on imprecision and bias, put into the context of an allowable total error, you can derive the sigma. You can get the sigma metric. If you're doing the other way, so if you're looking at pre-analytical processes and you're saying, how many hemolyzed specimens am I doing? The number of sample sizes, the number of samples you're counting matters quite a lot. Because if you were only going to measure 100 and then you have a defect rate, well, that gives you a confidence interval around that estimate of between 3.4 and 6 sigma. So if you're only measuring 100 samples, you don't really know what the sigma is. You have a number, but the confidence interval is so wide it could be any sigma. If you go up to 1,000 samples and then measure how many hemolyzed specimens there were, now your confidence range is 3.65 to 4. It's crossing 2 sigma zones, but at least it's getting there. If you're measuring 10,000 specimens, now that 1% is between 3.75 sigma and 3.9 sigma. It's within a single category. So really, you want 10,000 opportunities or measurements or outcomes in order to give yourself a really reliable sigmametric. For many labs, that's not a problem. For small labs, that might mean the counting approach is not really useful. Here's that 6 sigma table, and this table is very condensed. You can see a much more granular table with single decimal places, 10th decimal places. On our website, of course, there are 6 sigma tables all over the internet, in textbooks, everywhere. It's a standard thing. And you can see the rightmost column, that has the DPM, defects per million. On the short-term scale, that's the ones that everybody refers to. So at 6, you have 3.4 defects per million. At 3 sigma, you have 66,807 defects. At 2 sigma, it's 300,000 defects. At 1 sigma, it's worse than flipping a coin. And here we're returning now. This is to the first paper on sigmametrics. And they took their Q probe quality indicators, figured out what was the percent error, converted it to defects per million, looked it up in the table. So order accuracy, 20 years ago, 1.8% error, was a 3.6 sigma process. Basically, the minimum acceptable quality was happening for order accuracy 20 years ago. And here's a select group of those findings, and it was pretty discouraging. At the dawn of the 21st century, a lot of laboratorians thought, wow, we're doing a good job. I'm sure we're at 5, 6 sigma for all our processes. Basically, not a single process was at 6 sigma. And the best coming out was close to 5 sigma. That was the reporting of results. That was at 5 sigma, but some were below 3 sigma outright. Therapeutic drug monitoring timing was the sample taken at the right time. That was less than 3 sigma. Now let's move back to transforming these tolerance limits into total allowable errors. So we remember the concept. We have a target value. We know there's a tolerance specification. We want to squeeze 6 SDs, but where do we come up with those tolerance specifications? Is there one tolerance specification for all tests? For every process in the laboratory, for every test, is there just one tolerance specification? I'm sure you understand that every test is going to be different, so we're going to have different tolerance specifications for every test. So we have many different sources. You can look up in the CLIA guidelines. That's the dominant, the most commonly used quality requirement set in the world. And that's partly because not only is CLIA the law of the land in the US, it's enforced through the Joint Commission and the CAP accreditation programs, and those are global programs. So therefore, a lot of other countries follow the example of the CAP survey and use those proficiency testing goals. And CAP not only covers the CLIA goals for the regulated analytes, but all the non-regulated analytes also CAP provides specifications for. In the rest of the world, there are other EQA programs. They also provide their own quality requirements. So the RCPA, Royal College of Pathologists of Australasia, they have allowable limits of performance. The Germans have their Regelbach rules. There is a more evidence-based approach where you take into account the biologic variation of within different subjects, within a person, and you can derive how good a test needs to be based on what you know about how the test varies within a single individual. And Ricos and colleagues in Spain, they covered it from really about 15 years, from 1999 to 2014. And then the European Federation of Laboratory Medicine took that over in about 2015. And now EFLM has a database. It's not as many analytes, but there's more evidence, more recent evidence, better evidence. So those goals are available. And then we try and consolidate all of these different resources into a single set of recommendations in our Sigma verification program. One of the big challenges, of course, is all of these different sources of allowable total error, they don't agree. So the German goal and the Australasian goal and the CLIA goal, they may not be even close to one another. Very strange idea that, well, in Australia, your test results have to be better than they have to be in the US, and for some analytes, that's the US results have to be better than what you're going to be allowed in terms of error in Germany. And then there's an even set of Russian goals that are even much wider. That's not really how healthcare should work, but there's a lot of debate and so forth over what the right goals should be. And the latest guideline or a discussion of quality requirements that emerged from a meeting in 2014 in Milan, and what came out the next year has been called the Milan Consensus. And they give a hierarchy, a 3-level hierarchy. The first best kind of goal is outcome-based clinical use goals. Very few analytes achieve this, but if you think about the NGSP guidance for HbA1c, that's one of the few tests where we have knowledge of how is the test used by clinicians, therefore how good should we be in the laboratory to support the right diagnosis. The second approach is these biological-based goals. So the RICOS goals are what's now probably being called the EFLM goals. And then any other way to come up with goals is state-of-the-art. And not as preferred as the first two, but you can have better state-of-the-art goals than some sources. There is an acknowledgement that different tests will have different goals even from different models. So HbA1c might have the outcome-based goal. Other tests will have the biologic-based goal. Your electrolytes probably have to go with state-of-the-art. So your sodium, your chloride, and so forth, the biologic-based goals are almost impossible to achieve, so you have to go with state-of-the-art goals. But one of the challenges with the biological-based goals is some of them, particularly the EFLM goals, the most recent data has actually tightened those goals, and now for some methods, there's nothing on the market right now that can hit the target set by EFLM. Therefore, it's not a really practical goal. Maybe it's aspirational, but you're going to have to use something like a CLIA goal to be practical and achievable. Now, let's look at our common benchmarks. Go back to 20 years ago. These were the pre-analytical errors that we were seeing. Order accuracy was almost 4. Proficiency testing was just below 4 sigma. Reporting of results was close to 5 sigma. A lot of space between our achievement and that goal of 6 sigma. This is the most recent set of sigma metrics for pre-analytical processes, and this is coming out of an IFCC program where they have a global program to measure pre-analytical error rates, and they looked at the 50th percentile of the people who were of the labs in their program doing these monitoring, and there's a lot higher sigma metrics now, isn't there? The metrics have come right up, and if you think about it, well, we've had at least 20 years of strong focus on the pre-analytical phase of testing. There's many standing committees, many conferences devoted to pre-analytical errors and ways to reduce pre-analytical errors. And of course, in the same 20 years, we've seen a lot more automation. A lot more of the testing process is coming out of the hands of individual operators and being engineered into tracks and instrument systems and so forth. So these metrics can all come up. And as we noted earlier, samples that are not stored correctly, samples that are damaged, samples that were too long spent in the transport phase, the 50th percentile of the program from IFCC is achieving Six Sigma. I have to say, 20 years ago, I thought it was going to be a stretch for any lab to achieve Six Sigma on the pre-analytical process. But now it is happening. It is possible. We see a lot of 4 Sigmas. There's only 2 out of 19 different measurements. Only 2 of them are at 3 Sigma. So that is again, the microbiology samples, are they contaminated? And the other one is part of the hemolysis. They're free HB, and it's the hemolysis getting caught by an auto check. So hemolysis, which we know is a chronic problem in the 3 Sigma zone, and contaminated microbe. But everything else is in the 4 Sigma zone, which, remember, that's good. There's some 5 Sigmas, that's excellent, and a few processes, the 50th percentile of the laboratories in the survey, are in fact achieving Six Sigma, essentially 0 defects. Here, in contrast, are the sigmametrics for QC failure rates of Theranos. Notice, nothing at 6 Sigma, nothing at 5 Sigma, or 4 Sigma, or 3 Sigma. What's the minimum acceptable level of quality? 3 Sigma. Where are these QC failure rates? At 2 Sigma. Some of them are at 1 Sigma. Some of them are below 1 Sigma. The sex hormone binding. 87% of the time, the QC was out. That's worse than a coin flip, right? A coin flip, at least you have a 50% chance of being correct or getting in. This is why Theranos failed. This is the kind of data they were not willing to share with investors. They were trying to conceal this because they knew it was awful. This is the kind of performance that within the laboratory there were dedicated professionals who said, this is unacceptable, and if the lab management won't listen to us about this, I'm going to go blow the whistle. This is how $9 billion of market valuation goes to 0. If you're not willing to invest and achieve Six Sigma, you may not continue as a viable going concern. And now here's a different way to look at sigma levels, and this is just a generic instrument. I'm not trying to call out a particular diagnostic company, but here is an instrument, 35 clinical chemistry tests, and there are 69 control levels. So for the most part, it's 2 control levels per analyte, and I think we just had 1 level, and that's where we're at. So that's how we get to 69 different data points. And just think of the color coding as where the sigmas are. Okay, green is 6 Sigma, dark blue is 5 Sigma, light blue is 4 Sigma, yellow 3 Sigma, orange 2 Sigma, red less than 2 Sigma. So in our most recent look at the IFCC look at pre-analytical indicators, what did we find? 2 out of 19, about 10%, of pre-analyticals were at 3 Sigma. Well, here on this one instrument, we've got 30% of the quality at 3 or less than 3 Sigma. Now again, I know the common held wisdom is, where are all the errors happening? pre-analytical. Well, in the last 20 years, we've made huge improvements in pre-analytical quality. Have we made analytical improvements? Has the practice of QC advanced in the same way that it has at pre-analytical? If anything, the practice at analytical quality, it's degraded. If anything, there are instruments starting to flood the market that have less quality than what we saw in previous generations. This is really a concerning problem. There's a lot of analytical quality that is worse than what we see in the pre-analytical phase. We're going to wrap up now. We've hopefully understood more about Six Sigma, where it's coming from, what it means, how do we actually apply it in our lab. So here is the sigmametric equation. You've got a glimpse of it earlier. The tolerance limit, remember, that converts into that allowable total error. The bias, you get that from your proficiency testing or your peer group, or you're comparing against a reference method, or in a pinch, you can say, I have an assay control. They told me the mean should be here. This was on the insert. This is where my mean actually is that I'm observing. What's that difference? That's your bias. So you take the allowable total error, subtract the absolute value of the bias, and then you divide it by the CV. And that will give you a number, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe even higher than 6. The graphic is to give you an idea of how the equation works. Remember, we've seen these tolerance limits on either end before. We've seen that. In the center is the true value we're supposed to achieve. What does the bias tell us? Bias is saying, hey, we're not actually where patient's true health state is. We've shifted all the results. And then what does the CV tell us? It tells us, well, how spread out is this curve of results? Tight CV, it's really a compact curve. Big CV, we're pushing it out. We've got bigger, wider tails. So if we know that shift and the spread, we know where the curve's going to go. We know at which point, oh, it's going to exceed the allowable total error, and everything after that, those are the defects. Our next tool is a very simplified way to redesign how you do QC. We take the Westgard rules, we take Six Sigma, we put them together, Westgard Sigma rules. So it's the same, what we call the modern set of Westgard rules. Take out that 1,2S rule, causes too many false rejections anyway. And just use the rejection rules. But now, if you know the sigmametric, you also know how many Westgard rules you need to do. And I mentioned that earlier when we went through the different sigma zones. At Six Sigma, you basically don't need all the Westgard rules. You just need one rule, 1,3S. 5 sigma, you go to 3 Westgard rules. 4 sigma, 4 Westgard rules. 3 sigma, all the Westgard rules. Below 3 sigma, we don't have enough rules for you. Figure out as many rules as you can. You'll also note, if you look below the sigma zones on this, you'll see sample size. That's the latest approach. You can actually calculate how many samples can go past before you need to run another control. We don't see a lot of application of that yet, but the math exists. You can quantifiably determine how often you need to run QC. QC frequency is no longer arbitrary. You can calculate. And at Six Sigma, you can see, hey, I can go to running QC once every 1,000 patient samples. And then taking those recommendations and then working them into a multi-constituent QC world and other regulations, that's where we are in the science. The science meeting the reality, that's the sort of the state of where that is. If you want to use something a little more sophisticated than the Westgard Sigma rules, then we have this tool. I showed it earlier, but I didn't explain anything about it. It's It's called the method decision chart. And it takes that information, imprecision along your x-axis, bias along your y-axis. So if you know your CV and your bias, that's x and y, just plot yourself somewhere on the chart. And the diagonal lines, they create the sigma zones. Near the graph's origin, near the center, world-class Six Sigma quality. Thin sliver after that, that's 5 sigma excellent, 4 sigma good, 3 sigma marginal, 2 sigma poor, less than 2 sigma. I hope you'll consider that unacceptable. You can download a free spreadsheet that will do this for you. Easiest way to think about it, it's a target. Those diagonal lines are really like the rings of the target. Closer you get, fewer defects you'll experience, the more confidence you have in the result and the diagnosis. As imprecision and bias increase, more defects, more noise around that signal, more uncertainty out in the upper right, you're confusing clinicians. You're really not helping confirm a diagnosis. And if you remember the chart I showed earlier, again, we had 30% of the results at poor and unacceptable. Those areas could be confusing clinicians. To take that assessment and then turn it into a more granular kind of QC design. So if you want to do more than just look at one single set of Westgard rules and figure out, do I use 1, 3, 4, or 5 of them? We've got a normalized op specs chart. The diagonal lines here are now QC procedures. You're still doing imprecision along the x-axis, bias along the y-axis. It's still really set up like a bullseye. Closer to the bullseye, wider your limits go, fewer controls, fewer rules. As you have more imprecision, as you have more bias, more rules needed, tighter control limits. Well, the rules that you'll use will have tighter control limits. You'll need more controls. And then near the upper right, QC can't save you. Run as much QC as you can afford. Do other things if you can. Average of normals, other checks, and so forth. One of the reasons why Six Sigma is still a worthy approach is it can reduce how many rules you use, reduce how many runs you have to use for those rules, reduce the controls that you need, and reduce the false rejection. So if you're currently using the classic Westgard rules, that is, you start with a 1-2S warning and then you have 5 different rejection rules. Well, depending on where the sigma metric of your method, you're going to be able to reduce by a significant amount the amount of effort you're putting into things. So if you're using classic Westgard rules and turns out you have a bunch of below 3 sigma methods, actually you're going to find out I should run more controls, I should increase my frequency. If you're at 3 sigma, you can still actually, just by switching between classic Westgard rules to our modern set, more than a 16% decline in the number of rules you're going to use. If you can get to 4 sigma, a third of your rules are no longer necessary. 5 sigma will cut the number of rules you need in half. 6 sigma, 83% reduction of rules, because you're down to 1 rule. And instead of having to look at 4, 5, or 10 runs, you're looking at 1 run. 75% shorter focus on runs. And in terms of false rejection, well, we have, if we're doing classic Westgard rules, we might have 4% false rejection, which is a lot better than the 9% we would be getting if we're using just 2 SD limits. We can cut that in a third or 2/3, or if we have a Six Sigma method and we go to 3 SD, essentially we eliminate false rejection. And because of all of these reductions and controls can come down, runs can come down, rules can come down, labs that implement Six Sigma often see fewer outliers, less time spent troubleshooting, fewer out of control events, reduced purchase of controls, reduced consumption of reagents. So there end up being soft dollar savings in your staff and hard dollar savings in fewer things you're consuming, because you have fewer problems, you have fewer errors that you're chasing, you become more efficient. So let's resume or recap what we've learned. Six Sigma. It might not be a fad anymore. It might not be kind of a sexy management technique anymore. It is still helpful. You do not need a black belt or a green belt or any kind of belt. Please stay clothed to use Sigma metrics. Getting to Six Sigma, it might be hard, but every improvement in that metric as you go up has a payoff, has a return on investment. There are two ways. You can do the counting approach if you're looking at pre-analytics. If you're looking at the analytical quality, where we believe there's a lot of room for improvement, you can do the calculation. There are plenty of allowable total error resources out there. The challenge is picking the most appropriate one. Again, we try and help by making a consolidated set available to laboratories. And the sixth thing, Six Sigma metrics, they've improved at the pre-analytical phase, but on the analytical side, there's still a lot of room for improvement. It's a mixed bag. And finally, all the tools that I mentioned, the Westgard Sigma rules, the Sigma metric equation, method decision chart, OpSpecs chart, all of those you can download for free off our website. All the tools to apply Sigma metrics are free. The real cost, the real challenge is for you to say, I'm going to learn it, I'm going to apply it, I'm going to figure out how to do it in my lab, and I'm going to see it through so that I don't just calculate a number, I make a change. I actually change how my lab operates on the basis of what these Sigma metrics are telling me. And that brings us to the end of our formal lecture. I do want to highlight a few more resources for you. We have the textbook on Six Sigma for laboratory. That's available at westgard.com. We have a course on Sigma metrics available at westgard.org. And I mentioned earlier, we have a Sigma verification program. We work with more than 75 labs worldwide, more than 10 labs in the US right now, where we train staff in QC and Six Sigma. We also verify directly the level of quality being achieved by your instruments and your tests. And on that, again, I want to thank Lynn Lloyd and Technopath Clinical Diagnostics. Their sponsorship is why so many of you were able to register and attend. And now we'll open this up to questions. We have a number of questions. I'm going to start with one that was sent to me by email in advance. And this was a question about allowable total error. And how do you figure out the Sigma metric of a method when you don't have an allowable total error? And you could have, there are new tests where CLIA or CAP, they haven't caught up yet. They haven't said, by the way, this is how good you should be in order to pass proficiency testing. Therefore, that's the allowable total error. You might think about, in this pandemic world, we have a lot of new COVID-19 methods. What is the allowable total error for those methods? That's a real challenge. Right now, we've really been focusing on sensitivity, specificity, limit of detection. We haven't said, by the way, your CV should be this small. The methods are often so different, it's hard to decide if one allowable total error can encompass all the different testing methods. So In those, let's say we might not have allowable total errors unless we can look at how we're interpreting the patient results. Or what do we consider to be a significant shift in the testing values? So we really need to be more semi-quantitative and quantitative to come up with the sigma metrics in a calculation mode. You could do a simple counting approach if you have, if you have 1,000 patients that have run through your system, and you were using one method to diagnose them as, yes, you have COVID-19, no, you don't. But then you have other information, other clinical information that actually tells you the truth. By the way, this was a PCR positive person, this person was in the hospital with symptoms and so forth. Then you have the ability to determine, when did you make a defect? When did you call someone sick when they were actually healthy, or vice versa? Put that on the scale of, turn that error rate into a DPM. You can find out what is the sigma metric of your COVID-19 method. On the other side, if you had an imprecision, I'm not sure how you would figure out what the bias is unless there's target values coming. Then what you wanted to do in a quantitative sense is figure out what's the shift of that semi-quantitative result. You might have a signal to cutoff ratio. So you might have something like 1 is the cutoff. Well, how much does something have to shift on the low positive to go below 1.0? That becomes that distance, that zone, that becomes your allowable total error. The next, how frequently should I calculate my sigma metric? Do I do it every 6 months or annually? Or now it's interesting. There's capability and there's practicality. Practicality. Every 6 months, every year. In our sigma verification program, definitely we tell labs every year we need to know what the metric is. We encourage you to look at it at least every 6 months. Many labs in our program, or many labs that are applying sigma metrics, they're looking every 3 months. So like every quarter, they're figuring out their sigma metric for different tests. And those are on the tests that are pretty stable, like a lot of the chemistry analytes. There is software, and I've seen some software applications that can calculate your sigma metric every time you add a new data point from your QC. That might be overkill. Certainly mathematically, the computer has no problem updating a sigma metric, but really all that matters is not if it's 6.1 to 6.15. That's not a significant change. If it's when a 6 sigma drops to 5 sigma, or a 5 sigma drops to 4 sigma, those are significant changes that you do need to know about. But little fluctuations within the different sigma zones, that's not something you have to worry about. It really won't change how you do QC. Another question, where can I find Six Sigma benchmarks for lab QI monitors? Again, I think that IFCC committee on pre-analytical, there's probably other IFCC committees that are also chasing down different monitors. Another question, okay. So I'll say just another word about the Sigma verification program. I think the real appeal of that is you can do all these Sigma metrics. As I said, the tools are free. You could go do them, run the numbers, plot some graphs, make some QC choices. How do you know you did it right? Would you like a third party to come in and see what you've done and say, yes, you've done it correctly. Those are the right Sigma metrics. Those were the right goals to use. These are the right QC procedures to choose. And would you like to make sure that your staff understands how to do QC correctly and how to apply these Six Sigma metric approaches? If you answer to those yes, well then that's what Sigma verification can do for you, because we'll provide that additional insight. We'll help train. So we provide training in QC. We have a QC course. We have a Six Sigma metric course. We'll put staff in your lab through those programs. They have to pass 2 online exams to